Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Midwest Morris Ales Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion panel on accessibility in Morris communities. This is part of a series of panel discussions centered on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the Morris community in North America, produced by the Midwest Morris Ale. Creating change in the world starts with individual people. Our approach to creating social change is centered on three principles. Next slide, please. Awareness, attitude, and action. Our previous panels focused primarily on awareness and attitude and have highlighted many experiences of different people in our community. Here, in our fifth panel, we'll also talk about some actions we can take individually to foster accessibility and equity within the Morris community. We talk a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but what can we do? How can we make meaningful change? When we hear words like ableism and barriers, I suspect that many of us immediately try to envision something at the extreme end of mobility limitation, and then experience some resistance to that idea, and then guilt. So let's talk about this within the frame of accessibility issues. Next slide, please. The first step is recognizing assumptions that we make where biases may lie. Speaking of biases, it's also important to recognize upfront that the people on this panel are representative of survivor bias. When we are the people who have successfully navigated accessibility barriers to continue to participate in this community, not the ones who couldn't find solutions or didn't find the struggle to be worth the energy required. To start our conversation, we're gonna define a couple words that we'll be using. Accessibility. Accessible means a person with a disability is afforded the opportunity to acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services as a person without a disability in an equally effective and equally integrated manner with substantially equivalent ease of use. A disability is a physical or mental condition that limits a person's movement, senses, or activities. Ableism is the discrimination and social prejudice against people with disabilities based on the belief that typical abilities are superior. So as we start to talk about this, I want you to think about accessibility as the three-dimensional metric of which ability and disability lie on. So think of the different kinds of abilities and disabilities people have, such as vision, walking, mobility, using your hands, being able to talk, carrying on a conversation, thinking. All of these have ableism and disability built into them. So I'm going to start by, for everybody to scale this, think about your eyesight. Your eyesight can be scaled. We have 20/20 vision being like perfectly able. And then on the other end of that scale, you have being blind. And those of us who wear glasses are somewhere in between. And we can, with our glasses, then have accessibility to see the world as everybody else. With all of that being said, let's introduce our panelists tonight. I'm Valerie Young. I'm your moderator for this evening. You have seen me in many Morris communities wearing many different hats. I started Morris dancing about 10 years ago with Rock Creek. I've danced with the Capering Roysters in St. Louis and am now a Wayward Morris dancer in Atlanta. Becky, if you would like to introduce yourself.
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Becky Wright, and I have been Morris dancing for about 20 years. I started as a kid in Boston with Banbury Cross. I danced with Renegade Morris in Philadelphia for a while. I was a founding member of Brain Trust Morris, which Midwest Ale attendees know well. And I also was a founding member of Oxbow Morris in Western Massachusetts. And now also in Western Massachusetts, I dance with Marlborough Morris M. So that's, yeah. And I also, I'm a dancer, and I also am a musician and play accordion. That's my Morris background.
Thanks, Becky. Corey is the next person in my field division. Corey, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I am Corey O'Sullivan Bowser. I have been dancing with Ann Arbor Morris for working on my 26th year, I believe. I was also a founding member of the sometimes existing Quality Molly. I have been four on and off for a lot of the last 15 years. And so I have a lot of experience teaching both within the Morris community and in other parts of my life. And neurodivergent party over here. I think that's.
Thanks, Corey. That's perfect. Meg, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Meg Dedolph, and I've been dancing with Pullman Morris and Sword in Chicago for about 11 years now, and sort of loosely affiliated with Brain Trust for about that same amount of time. And I'm the squire of Pullman Morris, which means I get to send out all the emails.
Your team thanks you. So let's start off our conversation on accessibility with the question, how do we talk about accessibility and disability currently on our teams? Corey, you have your mouth open. You go ahead and start.
Okay. Well, so something that I wanted to hit on, especially within the context that we're talking about disability, accessibility issues, and to expand it to maybe people who don't consider themselves to be disabled, but that, you know, maybe have a trick knee or ankle or whatever joint, that sometimes there are certain things that they cheat out or bow out of and say, nope, trick knee, no, no, no. And that, you know, that it this discussion applies to probably a lot more of the community than we might think of when we hear the title of this panel. Um, I know a lot of people who only do certain parts of Bampton or do it in a very particular way because of the asymmetrical knee jamming. Um, and, you know, the other thing that I would like to think about and talk about that has come up for me is that this is something that we have to both learn how to do and teach people how to do. And I think something that often gets overlooked is different learning styles and the ways that people can take in the information that we have to give. And if we are not intentional about that, we can leave people out with our teaching style.
Is that something that your team talks about frequently, or is that something that leadership and Squire and Foreman on your team have talked about?
I think that it is a little of both. I will say, without getting into deep detail, that there are a wide variety of sometimes conflicting learning styles on Ann Arbor Morris. And over the last few years, I have learned to pre plan to teach things in three or four different ways, hanging on the beat, hanging on the tune, hanging on counting it out. Like, do I need to drive someone around by their shoulders or just let them do it poorly in private until they can get their unruly body parts together? Like, and letting everybody have the space and support to do that the way that they need to do has been incredibly helpful. So that's, I think, all that I had thought
That's
about.
wonderful.
Well,
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Meg.
I was just going to say that on Pullman, we're really fortunate to have a very wide range of ages on the team. Our youngest member is my kid, who is 13, and there are people on the team who are literally old enough to be my kids' grandparents. And so one of the challenges that we're really running up against, I think more so in the last few years than when I first started dancing with them, is that the core of the team, the people who founded it, are getting older, and there's a lot of at practice, sometimes there can be kind of a lot of frustration or a lot of dissatisfaction because people aren't moving the way they used to be able to move. And I think the challenge that we're facing, and it's the challenge that we're facing is finding a way for the team to be so that the folks who started this team a long time ago and who get, who we want to keep coming to practices, so that everyone can continue to dance together in the way that they would like to and are able to dance without creating a lot of tension. Like, I don't want people to feel apologetic because they can't jump as high as someone 30 years younger than them. And I don't want someone who is young to feel like they have to, to feel like a jerk because they can jump high, for example. So I think that's where we're at right now. In terms of kind of the internal life of the team. That's sort of what we're struggling with and thinking about, but no good answers yet.
Go ahead, Becky.
Yeah. So the way that I think I almost need to flip the question, because I don't think of my teams as talking about accessibility. I think of us as doing accessibility, which is to say that, we're not sitting around saying, what do we do about dancers with disabilities? We're saying, oh, how can we make sure that John can keep dancing with us and feel good about it? Or how can we make sure that, right? We're looking at it through the lens of individual team members and what they need and what is going to allow them to participate in a way that feels good to them. So an example of that is that on Marlborough Morris M, which I'll just call MMM, it's a bit of a mouthful. We do two traditions. We do Bampton and Longborough, and we have some members who just don't do Longborough anymore. They just, my knees don't like it. It's not my thing. I've just decided. So they only want to do Bampton dances. And, there are some other people on the team who love Longborough and want to dance Longborough. And so for our practices, we have designated that after the warm-up dance, the first half hour or so of practice is going to be Longborough, and made that as a sort of predictable, kind of structure to our practices, so that if someone doesn't want to do Longborough and feels like it's discouraging to just sit out on the side, that they can just show up half an hour later. So it's that kind of stuff, or just saying, oh, this person isn't doing stick dances right now, or this person isn't going to do a dance that has leapfrogs in it. It's really individualized. And I think that for a lot of teams is going to be the right approach. And it's just about keeping an eye out for, when do we need to make those adjustments? And as Corey mentioned, it's much broader than people who might identify as disabled or think of themselves as having a disability. We all have, it really is this sort of multidimensional spectrum. And so we're really looking at, what dancers do we have, and how are we going to dance, in a good and satisfying way that works for everyone.
Thank you. I think that flows nicely into our next question, which is, how does Morris as a form of traditional dance potentially foster community that is not inclusive or accessible? And how can we work to change that? This is a question about perhaps attitudes on this subject. And I think, Meg, perhaps if you could shed some light on maybe some of the Pullman's attitudes so far.
Well, I think one of the challenges I was noticing this at practice. I think one of the challenges is that obviously everyone comes from a very wide range of dance backgrounds and a wide range of engagement with various traditions. And we have some folks on our team who are really scholarly, man, like they have a well-thumbed copy of Lionel Bacon, and they know exactly what Cecil Sharp said to the Morris team at the University of Chicago in 1918 or whatever, so we have this incredible depth of scholarly research, which is great. And we have dancers on our team who have come to this primarily from like a contra dance background, where there's a pretty wide range of things you can do at a contra dance before someone looks at you funny. Like it's a very big tent. And we have some dancers on our team who come to this from other traditions, where there is a right way and a less right way to do things. And one of the things we've really had to accommodate is there a right way to do Morris? And what happens when the perception of the right way butts up against someone saying, well, my arm just doesn't do that, And it's been really interesting to navigate that with folks, to sort of, and sadly, we haven't always had the most productive discussions around what to do when the perception of the way that the dance should be done butts up against the reality of how the dance is happening. Something we were talking about earlier was the idea that like tradition is peer pressure from dead people. And at what point do you say, well, that was great when in 19 whatever, when it was recorded, but this isn't practical for us right now in 2022. So what are we going to do about that? So, Corey, I know you had earlier, you said some interesting stuff about like perception of the dance as a dancer and as an audience member. And I actually ended up talking to my team about that after I heard you say it.
Okay.
Because I thought it was so interesting.
Yeah. So, if we talk about Morris, even if we're only talking about North American Morris, I think in the broadest sense, we will all probably agree that this is a performative dance to be done for the viewing pleasure of some audience. At least on some level, I think that most of us will agree that is kind of what Morris is. And if that is the bar that we're using to measure things by, then I would say that the important metric for what makes any dancer or dance performance ready is what it looks like from an audience perspective, not what it looks like from the inside of a set. So there are a couple of things that I was looking at this, and I'm going to look at my notes just a little bit so I don't get off track. So first, I think what we tend to think about the bar for being performance ready is like altitude, to leave the ground. And I think that in reality, that bar is a lot lower than we tend to think it is. We, a few years ago, had a member of the team with 2 artificial knees who did not really leave the ground at all, but could travel laterally just fine. And from inside of the set, the difference could be borderline distracting to some dancers, and there was some grumblings about it until the point when we were watching a video of us performing at a fair, and from the outside of the set, you could not tell at all because he was a drummer and his timing was exactly where it needed to be. And you just wouldn't even see it unless you knew that you were looking for it. which, you know, brings us to what I think maybe where the bar actually is, which is precision and unison of effort. So as long as you're doing things in time, marking the beats, doing the specifics of exactly how you execute that, I don't think matter as much as we imagine them to matter. And it's to remind, and if people are getting weird about it, just remind them from the audience perspective, it needs to look good from out there. And what is demonstratively different than looking uniform from inside the set. And I don't know. I think Becky had another point that we're all very excited to hear, and we all laughed out loud. So hopefully y'all will also.
Yeah. I can jump in with what I think that point is, which is that, and I think this is not just about ableism and disability. It also ties into a lot of the like history and gender politics of Morris and just some sort of specific things. But there is or can be in some corners of the Morris world what I've heard people call the TMJ dance aesthetic. TMJ being tall men jumping. And I think we all sort of have an intuitive sense as Morris dancers of what that aesthetic is. This idea that, you know, ideal Morris dancing, right? The best Morris dancing that there is that there are all of these tall, skinny men with really springy legs, and they all look exactly the same, and they're all jumping like 1,000,000 feet off the ground, and that's, you know, as good as it gets. And I think part of tackling ableism in Morris dancing, you know, again, tied into gender, tied into all of these other different things, but part of tackling that is saying, wait a minute, why is that the ideal? And is that actually the only yardstick, you know, by which we measure good Morris dancing? Controversial opinion. It shouldn't be. You know, and I think that it kind of also ties into some of what Corey was saying about the set looking unified, right? That the best Morris dancing is not measured by number of inches off the ground, which again, if your hankies are all the way up there, how much is the audience really noticing that? You know, but how do you make a set that looks really good and cohesive and is fun to dance in and to feel like you're all moving together? And you can do that with a really wide range of bodies. And that's sort of the mic drop moment is, you know, that if what you're sort of using as your yardstick for what the best dancing is a one particular type of body and one particular type of movement, that's always going to feel kind of shitty to people who don't have that kind of body or who can't enact that kind of movement. And so I think, you know, I think it's sort of just something that was sort of like a you know, brain exploding, like what galaxy brain moment for me to say, oh, right, you know, here's this thing that I had completely internalized and never questioned. And actually, you know, if I think about the Morris dancing that has been the most fun to watch, some of it is absolutely tall men with springy legs, and some of it is absolutely not. You know, and we can think in a broader way, and more people can do more satisfying dances that way. So that's, yeah, I think it's worth saying.
I love that so much.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I started dancing, even the people around me holding up this ideal of tall men jumping, and like they got the biggest cheers. And as a dancer, I'm not a tall man and I can't jump that high. And it was very hard to identify with, but also really exciting whenever I saw it. And it has taken me a while to realize that is not the only way to Morris dance. And There are other ways that are more inclusive for Morris dancing. So how do you put, after you recognize this bias or any other kind of biases that you have of how Morris dancing should look, how do you bring that into your practice and into your team that increases your team's inclusivity and accessibility?
Well, I think that probably one is thinking, and because I come at this from a fours perspective, thinking about the way we teach, which is maybe not boot camping newbies out of their first practice with sore knees so that they never come back. Because I know that when I first started dancing, and I have seen many other people do it, we tend to start by teaching stepping and drilling it and drilling it and making people do like 30 great capers in a row, which we never actually do. And then that person is like, you know, you might see them in your life a few days later and they're like, I can't do this. I'm not built for this. Because it is an athletic activity to some extent, but if we teach it like it's CrossFit, then I think that we are probably driving people off that are in fact perfectly capable of doing what we actually do. Which is a whole train of thought that came to me like just now. But also that if you're looking for a way to evaluate how you are doing as a team and whether you are doing it right, is video yourselves. Get that outside perspective, even if you don't have it available. 30 not so great capers in a row. Yes. But that seeing what you look like from the outside can really help with that sort of thing. I feel like maybe you two have talked about some other things that might be more helpful than what I had written down to say next. So,
Yeah, I think something that also kind of just came to me, but that I think is relevant here is around modeling, and specifically around this idea that, you know, I mean, I talked already about the sort of this individualized approach to saying, you know, okay, what do people need and how are things going to work for them? But like making sure that longtime dancers, that, you know, people who we think of as strong dancers on the team are modeling, saying, you know, hey, you know, my wrists are feeling a little off. I'm not going to do leapfrogs tonight. On modeling, just making those kinds of adjustments routine and not a big deal, and not something that's like a special thing we have to do because you're, you know, you have a thing, right? It's just an everyday part of practice. And on a number of the teams that I've been on, you know, that creating this culture of like, we are a team where we listen to our bodies, and where if our four is, is teaching something and we're struggling with it physically, saying, hey, you know, my knee is having trouble with getting around. Do you have any tips for dealing with that? Maybe someone else, you know, figured out a way to kind of cheat a turn a little bit to make that work. Just making it not a big deal, right? Making it something that we just do all the time to adjust for these like weird bodies that we live in. And this also goes, I think, for, you know, we haven't talked a lot yet about other types of disabilities, about not, you know, Corey talked some about learning styles, but also normalizing things like just saying like, hey, you know, I'm going to walk out of the room for 10 minutes because, you know, I just need, you know, I need to be in a space that's quiet, or, you know, asking for some different kind of learning or adjustment, or saying, you know, oh, hey, if you know, just, yeah, like that kind of stuff, right? Just it doesn't have to be a big thing.
yeah,
I think that's the takeaway.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I got excited. We use quick, and I'm going to call them for our purposes consent checks. We in belly to belly in Bampton. Sometimes we bounce off, sometimes we don't. It's always a conversation that happens about 5 seconds before it either does or does not occur, and whatever the answer is fine. It's usually, do you want to bounce? And somebody will either say yes or no, and whatever the answer is fine. And we were discussing with, I was discussing with someone, with Eleanor, about when you do these checks, you need to accept and believe people's answers. Not pouty face, not beggy, not, but like if they just say, I can't, I need to rest right now, or my wrists are not up to bone cracking stick clashes, gentle tapping, or I'm not dancing, then like you need to accept that and not try to force people to do things that might disable them the next day or week. Sorry, I got excited, but yes.
It's all good. I love that idea of consent checks. Meg, we haven't heard from you on this topic of how do you approach your team practice or gatherings in an inclusive, accessible way.
Well, from the earlier discussions that we've had preparing for this panel and things like that, we decided to try some, by we, I mean I, decided to try some stuff at practice. Me and the mouse in my pocket. We're kind of at an interesting crossroads right now because our 4, ironically, is not dancing with us anymore because of health issues. Just things are just not working. And so we're sort of drifting 4-personless right now. And so a lot of people have been doing teaching and have been taking the responsibility of dancing the number 1 position, things like that, which has been really cool because it's been a chance for lots of people to try out teaching little bits of dances and lots of people to see what works. But we spent some time at practice a couple weeks ago really working on things like straight lines and getting to the same spot at the same time as the other people on either side of you. And we stopped before it got really tedious, which was great because sometimes we don't. And everyone came out of that practice feeling really good about what we'd accomplished and feeling like we'd really made some steps toward working together as a team and accommodating all the different stuff going on, just in terms of what people can and can't do. So I thought that was a really good development, and I'm looking forward to more work in that vein. I think we're never going to be a high jumping team. That's just not us. And that's okay. But I think what we can do is we can work on being a much more precise team. So, we'll see. Maybe people will start yelling nice lines during the show dances at the Ale instead of higher. We'll have to find out. Who knows?
Noted. And I will be shouting that at Pullman at the next Ale.
Yeah, well.
I'll even print out a poster board that says nice lines for you.
More together. I like that. It'll be an interesting dimension to Morris Dance cheers.
Yeah. I had just a quick thought before we move on to the next question. Becky was talking about just making adjustments to your team to make it accessible and make those adjustments the norm and the reality of what's going on. And I keep thinking about some teams that I've visited or danced with who have made adjustments to like the social structure of their team or the leadership structure of their team to accommodate people with different abilities. So for example, I know there's a couple teams who have some really introverted people who want to be part of the team, but they don't want to be the performers. And so they've taken up the role as cameraman. So, you know, find your introverts, everybody, and get yourself a team photographer. And then there was one team that I danced on that we had a retired Morris dancer who still wanted to be part of our team, and nobody wanted to be squire that year. So we elected her squire, which gave her an excuse to come and be part of the community again. So there's more than one way to look at how to be inclusive of different abilities, not just within the dancers, but also within your musicians and within the bigger Morris community. And even as you're dancing out, are you looking at, is this place that we're dancing out accessible to the public that we want to come enjoy this Morris? So things to think about. Which leads us to our last question of this panel. Panelists, I'm going to open this up to you with any other final thoughts you have. And then in particular, if you can give our listeners and viewers an action item of how to bring accessibility home. What can we do? Corey, I know that you had a very tangible take home.
So, two actually. The first one is video yourselves dancing. And, you know, which I'm coming back to again, but it was when we started doing that, team photographer, when we started doing that and then actually looking at the footage, it completely changed our perspective on what was and was not working in terms of aesthetic, altitude, precision, all of those things. And that, you know, maybe not everybody can do an X caper super high, but if you kind of look up while you're doing it, it looks like you're going higher. And, you know, that I think that trying to get that outside perspective, and maybe this is another role for somebody who isn't currently prepared to dance for whatever reason, but if they know the dance, then they can come and be your eyes, which is super useful, especially if you have a smaller team where maybe all of the able-bodied dancers need to be dancing to make the set happen. Just a thought. And then I think the other things are being active about checking with the people you're dancing with. How are we sticking? Do you want to break the sticks, or are we being gentle? You know, and I think that not everybody has to have like a great campaign, but if you just make an effort to check in with your set, whether that is with your team or at an ale with 5 other people you've never met before and that you're dancing with for the first time, to check in with all of them and make sure that we've kind of got an understanding that we can communicate while we're moving and say, you know, you are hurting me, don't hit the sticks so hard, or, you know, do you want to bounce off on the belly to belly? Whether, you know, either way, that we need to communicate and pay attention to the people around us. And it's like the murmurations of starlings that fly around in amoebas. Somebody determined, I don't know how, that they are paying attention to the 6 birds closest to them and making sure they don't collide. And then the rest of it all just happens organically. So there's your individual takeaway.
I love that. I love that. I'm going to watch the 6 dancers I dance with to make sure we're dancing together.
I mean, the math almost comes out. Just pretend that it works.
Almost. Meg, do you have a takeaway?
You know, I was thinking about the 6 dancers dancing together. And it's I was thinking about this because we sort of have this joke on Pullman where someone will say, let's dance Highland Mary. Okay, great, we'll dance Highland Mary. And the like almost as on cue, someone will say, wait, how does the hay go? So like we all recognize this on the team. We've sort of turned it into this joke where we'll all get up for a set and the first thing someone will say is, and now we will review the hay in Bucknell. Because we all know we're going to end up there anyway, for whatever reasons, just doesn't stick. But I guess the larger point, thinking about the murmurations of starlings, is that it is difficult to think about and to be aware of your position relative to the set when you're still stuck in your own head thinking about how the actual dance you're trying to do goes. And like again, going back to starlings, in thinking about this, I wonder if for us the place we need to go with some of the things we're working on before we can be aware of the set as a whole is to think about is to help people better understand where they are in the set as an individual. I was thinking about something also, this is getting rambling, but I was thinking about something that happened at practice where we were discussing actually the Bucknell hay. And one of our dancers said, well, you have to allow for a little bit of expansion in the set here at this point, so these people have exactly enough time to get around. And I was looking at this thinking, yes, you do, but not tonight. Like tonight, I just want the people in the front to remember which way to turn. Like that's the goal for me looking at this. I'm like, that's where I see the hesitancy. So it's definitely given me some stuff to think about. And how does this all come back to accessibility? Well, I guess it always comes back to accessibility, because part of understanding where you are and part of understanding where the other dancers is just has to do with a better understanding of what we can all do together. And that is probably our biggest challenge. So I don't know, Becky, do you have something profound? Because I
don't know that I have anything profound, but I think I'll just reiterate, things that I have kind of mentioned throughout. But I feel like the immediate and actionable thing that everyone can do is sort of go to your next team's practice or dance out or whatever it is and think about that aesthetic, think about what you value, think about like what good dancing is to you. And then the sort of like less, lofty daydreamy piece is to think of each of your dancers and each of your community members as individuals and let each person self-determine. And like, as a longtime dancer, as the squire, as whatever role you have, you really want to empower individual people to decide what's going to work best for them. There's kind of nothing worse as someone with a disability or a physical limitation as someone else coming in and deciding what you need. And it's more common than you'd think. So starting those conversations, talking to people, and for some people, that's just going to mean really minor adjustments in, handling certain little moments in the dances. For some people, that's going to mean what of the repertoire they do or don't do or only do sometimes. For some people, that is going to mean figuring out how to stay a part of the community without dancing, if dancing isn't something that they're going to do anymore, or was never something that they were going to do. I learned to play the accordion because I was having a lot of trouble with my knees, and it seemed like the easiest, and it seemed like an appealing way to. I'm not going to call learning to play the accordion easy, but it seemed like a really easy way to say, hey, I'm going to stay in this community. I'm going to stay, I'm going to stay part of it, and that is how I'm going to do it. Obviously, not everyone can or wants to or should learn to play the accordion, but you know, but there are a lot of ways to stay involved, as Valerie was talking about. And you know, again, it's just, yeah, think outside the box and empower people to make, you know, to make choices that are going to be good for them. And you know, and if you have this common idea as a team of sort of your values and your goals for dancing, you know, accessibility isn't like a hindrance. It's not something that's going to get in the way of good dancing. It's something that's going to enable better dancing.
Cool. And
Thank you. That was really wonderfully spoken, and I think a great point to end this conversation on. So everybody, I hope that all of our listeners have gotten some food for thought at the very least from this. And these are all wonderful points made by all of our panelists tonight. So thank you, panelists, so much for joining us. I want to, at the beginning of this panel, we talked about definitions of ableism, disability, and accessibility. And I'm so glad that we were able to unpack some of the ideas of how this expressed in our Morris community. Thank you, panelists, for joining us. Thank you, audience members, for listening in. Thank you, and good night.